Thank you, Dongil. Thank you, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. For me, it's the culmination of a 10-year journey. When I first joined ILO's Cooperatives Unit 10 years ago, it was the International Year of Cooperatives, and the portfolio had a huge amount of visibility at the level of the UN. So there were a lot of, visits to countries, presentations, and for myself, for our colleagues, leaders in the institution. And I soon realized that there was an issue with the data. Either there was nothing or very little available from the national statistic offices. What was available as administrative data was when comparing different sources, there were vast differences. So it was clear that there was an issue of comparable, harmonized methodologies. Of course, I went to our colleagues, the ones who are the experts on this in the ILO, our statistics department colleagues, and they said, look, this issue of having improved statistics on cooperatives hasn't really come up with the national statistic offices. What has come up is that there is this category of members of producer organizations under employment status, and it's not really working. This is an old formulation that belongs to a different era, and actually that needs to go. So we agreed that in the upcoming, the 19th conference, International Conference of Labor Statisticians, this issue of the unique nature and contribution of cooperatives economically, socially, environmentally needed to be brought up, and the gaps around the data need to be brought up. The resolution that came out from the 19th ICLS, what it did was noted the need to carry out further development work on the measurement of cooperatives. In the meantime, we brought up this issue with our colleagues in the Committee on the Promotion and Advancement of Cooperatives. We started issuing papers, country case studies. Some of the colleagues who worked on those are here with us today, Hyunsi, Chiara. And COPAC decided to set up a technical working group on statistics of cooperatives, and this working group has come up, where Marie was the lead, come up with conceptual work and how to operationalize the measurement issues around cooperatives, their contribution to employment and work, their economic contribution. And we were very fortunate to have, of course, the support also from the institutions like FAO, UN Statistics, ICA colleagues, and achieved the presentation of guidelines on statistics of cooperatives during the 20th ICLS, which resulted in these adoption of these guidelines. And 4 years later, we are here all together and launching these country case studies, initiatives to see how these guidelines work when they apply to the national context. Many thanks to everyone who has been a part of this journey and continue to be so. It's humbling to see how long these things take. But it's also inspiring that there's so many people who are passionate about getting statistics right on cooperatives to be able to measure their contribution right at national governments, cooperative movements, academia, research institutions, and the statistics lead, of course, is key. National Statistic Office lead is key on this issue. I think those are my words. I look forward to this progress, the progress of this work. I thank also Don Gil for taking this challenge on as a secondee from the Ministry of Finance of the Republic of Korea. He came on last year and took it on and has been running with it. We have the International Labour Conference coming up in 2 weeks' time on decent work and social and solidarity economy, where, of course, issue of statistics will come up for the SSE, which is wider than cooperatives, but the work that the steps that are being undertaken around co-op statistics will no doubt also inform and inspire that work. Thank you, and back to you, Dongil. Dongil, you're muted.
Yeah, I asked Sima to introduce today's key speaker, Marie, and Thursday speaker, Hyun-sik.
So the two speakers are Marie and Hyun-sik.
Yes.
Marie, welcome. Good morning. Thank you for being very much a part of this work since its very early stages. You are now not only the guru on statistics of cooperatives internationally, but also making the mark on on statistics of social and solidarity economy. So Marie was the chair of the COPAC Technical Working Group on statistics of cooperatives. She is also the chair of the scientific committee of CIRIEC. And the floor is now yours, Marie. And should I introduce Hyun-sik now as well, Dongil, or wait?
Yes, you can, because
okay.
you don't attend on Thursday, right?
Sorry, I didn't understand.
You can. Yes, you can.
Okay. Hyun-sik is a staff member of the International Cooperative Alliance, the strategy and statistics coordinator. We have been collaborating with Hyun-sik also since almost now, yes, 10 years when he was at the time working with COPA. He's also the author of the report on cooperatives and employment, and has been thinking and working on these issues for many years. And thank you, Hyun-sik, also for being with us today. So the floor is Marie's now, Dongil.
Sure, please, Marie.
Marie, please go ahead. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Simel. Thank you, Dong-il. Hello, everyone. When Simel says I'm a guru, I have all my master teachers in front of me right now. So I thank you for being here today. And thank you, Simel. You said almost everything Dong-il has asked me to say, so I will be quicker to bring you through the steps that we're taking in the direction of having guidelines and eventually a manual. I will share my screen. So I was asked by Dong-il to walk you through the road to the guidelines. So the first question many people will ask, if they don't already have statistics on cooperatives, will say, why do we need them? Basically, it's part of the economy, but what we claim, and we all here, I think, agree to this, that it's a different part of the economy. These enterprises are at the service of needs and aspirations of people and of their communities who democratically control them. It seems obvious, but it's quite a big difference with the rest of the economy. Cooperatives adopt specific economic behavior, such as buying at fair price, selling at cost price, creating quality jobs. And they do this prior to making profits, which doesn't mean that they don't make profits, but then they allocate this profit in a much different way than a for-profit shareholder enterprise. Hence, they produce a more equitable distribution of wealth to people and to communities first, reinvesting in the organization and redistributing in proportion to patronage or usage. So statistics, of course, are standards, and they tend to reduce the diversity of the reality, but we do need them. And the question is, what should be counted? First, we have to recall what cooperatives do. They have an incredible capacity to stabilize markets, to countervail concentrated market powers, to internalize social costs, and reduce information asymmetries. And of course, they get involved in producing collective and trust goods and services. They seem to be more resilient in times of crisis. They seem to contribute to strengthening democracy, to encourage civil society to take an active role in economic, social, and political affairs. And they seem to be innovative as they respond to new needs and new aspirations, such as recovery, recycling, renewable energy, food security, and so on. So far, we know these things, and we all know these things, but it's from ad hoc surveys or studies that cover a limited set of industries, sometimes a limited set of organizations, or a limited set of countries. But we need statistics to justify public support and to calibrate policy in support of cooperative development. As Simel mentioned, there has been a growing interest in statistics for cooperatives. As Simel mentioned, when the observations were made about statistics on cooperatives, we found that there were various definitions of a cooperative, various methodologies. And of course, this explains itself by the diversity of the historical, economic, and political context in which the cooperatives exist. But of course, it makes it quite difficult to aggregate and to compare the data. And in many cases, in many countries, the cooperatives are still under the radar of national statistics offices. So we need measurement, not only for public recognition, but also for mutual recognition between cooperatives inside of the cooperative world, and of course for public policy to have an understandable way of talking about cooperatives. So there's been significant work, as Simel mentioned, already produced by CICOPA, CIRIEC, EURICSE, the ICA, the ILO, COPAC, UNDESA, and this work has been going on. And it has to be recalled also that the ILO is the only UN agency which has the responsibility, the mandate for cooperatives. It's been working between the ILO unit, part of the enterprise department, together with the statistics department of the ILO in leading this work. The COPAC is the Committee for the Promotion of Advancements of Cooperatives. It's a multi-stakeholder partnership. And you can see, I have to move your faces to see myself on my screen. You can see the members of COPAC at the moment that we were working to start this work. So the ILO, of course, the UNDESA, the FAO, the ICA, and the World Farmers Organization. The ICLS is a specialized body of the ILO, and it is an organization that meets every 5 years, bringing together representatives of workers, employers, and government to discuss recommendations and standards for statistics. And the technical working group was created under this, under the COPAC. So a first meeting led to decide to create a working group and to bring together organizations and representatives of different countries, specialists in cooperatives and specialists in statistics. So these are the main protagonists of this story. Someone's dog is expressing itself. I'm trying to move my screen here. Okay. So I'm borrowing this slide from someone from the ILO who had prepared it first, and I'm adding to it. So we see here the progress and the steps towards having a manual. There was, of course, the recommendation in 2002, where part of the recommendation is explicitly said we need to improve statistics on cooperatives. There was a first mention of cooperatives at the 19th International Conference of Labor Statisticians in 2013. And there was follow-up work commissioned by the ILO of mapping 69 countries and producing 11 national case studies. And in 2016, I presume, if I remember well, we created the COPAC Technical Working Group. This led to working and analyzing documents, analyzing legislations, analyzing how statistics were produced, and produce a conceptual framework, which was collectively approved by the Technical Working Group in 2017. This led to producing, I don't recall how we called it, a guideline to guideline or a manual towards the guidelines. Anyway, and in 2018, the ICLS was introduced with the guidelines and adopted them, and they were further on adopted by the ILO governing body. So here we are now at the stage where we are going to do pilot studies and eventually bring ourselves towards a manual. It might be important to recall at this time the difference between a resolution, a recommendation, a convention. What the ICLS adopts are either resolutions or guidelines, but none of them are binding. So they are recommendations and they are to be considered as much as possible, where conventions adopted by the ILC would be binding. So just a few notes, if I have time, about the conceptual framework. This is something Simel did not talk about, so it's up to me. This was part of our reflection when we were discussing before the guidelines were written. So what is a cooperative? Of course, we need to start with the ICA ILO definition of what is a cooperative. And that is an agreed upon definition that's been used everywhere in the world. And you all know it, of course. But if we try to decompose it in different subsets, we see that it's an enterprise with a legal identity, and it has specific functioning principles which relate to its specific role and identity. It is a member-based organization with a shared identity of the member users. Members are users. And it carries specific objectives and functions related to these member users' needs and aspirations. So we can see this small representation of a two-fold organization. In reality, there's only one, but mentally, we can see that there's a group of people that creates an organization to serve the purpose of the group of people. So there's a double link, one of ownership and one of usage. And there's the idea that the association controls the enterprises, and the enterprise is there to help whatever usage is needed by the members. So of course, a conceptual definition in a drawing will not convince any statistician to produce statistics. So we need to move on to a more operational definition. So if we remember this two-fold organization, we see at least 4 components. One is the association of people, of members. Another is the enterprise. And there's the 2 links between them, one of ownership and one of usage. So we need to understand how this organization will be characterized accordingly to these different elements of the combinations. So members, they're they join voluntarily. Enterprise it's formally established as an institutional unit. Ownership, a cooperative is owned and controlled democratically by its member. And democratically means one member, one vote. And usage, because the primary reason to exist is usage, the distribution of profits and surpluses among the members is not directly linked to the capital, but to the contribution by each member. It's not its contribution in capital, but its contribution in patronage and usage. And because we needed to try to see, are there types of cooperatives? We looked at the different roles the cooperative could play in relation to the members. And we ended up with 3 types of cooperatives and one as a multi-stakeholder. Let me show you how we understood this. So coming back to this little drawing, we see that if the members are producers, of course, they want to control the enterprise. They want to be one member, one vote. But what they really want is prices that are at least market or better than market for their products. If I'm thinking only economically. If I look at consumer cooperatives where members are clients, what they want is a price that is at least market or under the market, closer to a fair price. And if it is a worker cooperative, well, what they will want is first a job and then to have a good work conditions. So the functions of cooperatives are specific. They maximize the value for members' products, services, or savings. They minimize intermediation costs for members in their purchase of products or of services or when they take a loan. And they ensure the availability or reduce the risk to members of a managed resource or held asset, such as in a housing cooperative. So if you want to have more about these things, you can refer to the references I used today to prepare this presentation. And they are all available online. So you have the conceptual framework, which was published by the ILO. You have a compendium, a book where we bring together much of the work that was done in the intermediate phases of our work, which was published jointly by the ILO, CIRIEC, and COPAC. And of course, you have the guidelines. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marie. Before we move on to David's orientation session, I only introduce the national consultant who just selected last week. So let us begin with the latest one, Ahmed Makbel. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you. Yeah, it's good afternoon. I don't know there if it's morning. My name is Ahmed Makbel from Tanzania. I'm a retired statistician working with the National Bureau of Statistics for 26 years, and then later moved to the Prime Minister's Office, Labor, Youth, Employment, and Persons with Disability. So I'm happy to join you in this orientation. I wish to learn more from you, and thank you very much for invitation.
Thank you. Carlos, you're the second latest, please.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you everybody for being here. My name is Carlos Gonzalez. I'm the national consultant for Costa Rica. Good morning from here, very early morning. So yes, I work as research and project development officer for Cooperatives of the Americas since 4 years ago, something around that. And it's my pleasure to join you here today.
Thank you, Carlos. Okan from Turkey, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Orkun Doğan. I'm a PhD candidate in economics, studying in Istanbul, and I will work as the national consultant of Turkey for this project. I am also a cooperative member of Yerköy Local Studies Cooperative, which is established in 2019 in Ankara. And it's a scientific research and development type of cooperative. So I'm excited to be part of this project in collaboration with you guys, all of you, and the National Advisory Committee of Turkey. It would be a very enlightening experience for me to collaborate with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Okun. Next will be Massimo from Italy.
Hello, everybody. My name is Massimo Lori, and I work at ISTAT, the National Institute of Statistics, where I work mainly on the non-profit sector and social cooperation. I appreciate a lot the possibility to join this project, and we'll do a good job together.
Thank you, Massimo. Dr. Juyop An from Korea, the floor is yours.
Hi, yeah, I'm Korean consultant, national consultant. I have worked since 1999 for Korea Labor Institute. And recently I tried to construct statistics on the co-op in Korea. Yeah, I did a little big survey for two times, and finally I joined this league to make cooperative statistics to be a little bit alive in some sense. Yeah, it's nice to meet you all of you. Thank you.
Thank you all. So now it's time to give the floor to David Hunter, today's and Thursday's instructor for all of us.
To unmute here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I guess before I share my screen for this first presentation, I should briefly try to introduce myself. Is that okay, Daniel?
Sure.
Well, my name is David Hunter. I'm the global consultant, at least for this part of the project, and hope to continue to be so. I'm a retired senior statistician from the ILO Department of Statistics, where my main responsibilities was for development and implementation of statistical standards, international standards for labor statistics. In particular, I was responsible for development of for the revision of the International Standard Classification of Occupations and support for its implementation. I was involved at the 19th ICLS in the development of the standards for statistics of work, labor underutilization and employment. And I led the work on the revision of the International Classification of Status and Employment, adopted in 2018 at the 20th ICLS. Since I was also involved at that time in providing support to the technical working group on technical matters around the guidelines on cooperative statistics, and in particular in ensuring that they were aligned with the new resolution on statistics of work relationships, and the International Classification of Status and Employment. Since 2018, when I had to retire from the ILO because of my age, I've been working, I've been running my own very small consultancy company. I'm usually the only employee. I sometimes have subcontractors supporting both the ILO and other agencies on labor statistics and matters of statistical classification. just briefly, prior to joining the ILO in 2006, I worked for 20 years at the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And at the time I left, I was Director of Standards and Classifications for social and labour statistics, and was also responsible there for data management and survey processing. So a very long history in labour statistics and social statistics generally. So with that, I should get on with this work and introduce you to the guidelines concerning statistics of cooperatives. For that, I need to start the presentation and share my screen. Or share my screen and start the presentation, because I can't see the button to share my screen with the presentation started. There were always little technical issues here.
Sorry, David, can I suggest just one thing? Before we dive into the oriented session, why don't you just turn on the camera and have a big picture for all of us, and then move to the oriented session. Okay. So colleagues, please turn on your camera just for a second.
Am I there?
Thank you. Just a few more colleagues. Okay, let's do this. Okay, say cheese. 1, 2, 3. Thank you. Cheers. Yeah.
Okay.
You can turn off.
Can I share my screen and see if I can get you to see the presentation? I may have too many windows open. It could be a little confusing at first. I think it's this one. Yeah, and here we go. Right. Can you all now see my screen? Okay, I think you should be able to see my screen. So essentially, you're going to have to listen to me for most of the afternoon, except that I will stop and pause and give you a time to ask questions. In this first presentation, I'm just going briefly to cover the guidelines and how they serve to serve the needs for internationally comparable statistics on cooperative statistics. I didn't know what Marie was going to say, so she's already covered quite a lot of the material, as I suspected that she would. But so I should go through this first presentation fairly quickly. What you see on the left-hand side of the screen, essentially Marie's already covered quite well, probably more thoroughly than me. But essentially the cooperative ownership model and democratic governance principles do ensure that cooperatives are driven by the needs of their members. And at this particular time in human history, when we're really at a massive turning point in terms of population growth, global warming, massive international migration for both work and for other reasons. There are pandemics happening, which are also related, obviously, to the population explosion. There are massive advances in technology going on. And all of this is having an unprecedented and rapid impact on the nature of the work that we do, on the way that work is organized. Now, the cooperative principles that Marie has already told us about, in putting members' needs ahead of profits, can have a strong influence on some of these issues and mitigate some of the negative impacts of the massive change that is going through. But this is often not recognized. The importance of cooperatives, the relevance of the cooperative model isn't well understood. Certainly not in the statistical community that I come from, or by the public in general. And there is clearly a need for hard data to inform policy that will assess the special impact of cooperatives in promoting all of those things on the left-hand side of my screen, which Marie has already talked about. So moving on from that, to meet all of those needs internationally, what do the statistics of cooperatives need to cover? First of all, information is needed on the number of cooperatives and the types of cooperatives that exist. Information is needed about the members, but not just about how many members each cooperative has. How many people are a member of a cooperative? How do cooperatives impact on the lives of people through membership? Many people are members of many more than one cooperative. Some people aren't members of cooperatives, but we don't have any information about that. What are the types of members that exist? Are they producer members, worker members, etc.? What are their characteristics? If they're in a housing cooperative, is it one member? But is that member actually, are all that members' households benefiting from the services of the cooperative, of a housing cooperative? We very rarely have that type of information. Cooperatives also generate work. They generate work for their members. They generate work for employees, and they generate multiple different types of work. They generate work in enterprises that are supported by cooperatives. They generate work in enterprises that are subsidiaries of cooperatives. And we all agree, those of us here who are interested in cooperatives, that they make a very important economic contribution. But there's no agreed methodology to measure the special contribution of cooperatives. And because of that, the guidelines don't provide detailed definitions for this aspect, but do talk about the importance of developing special measures for the economic contribution of cooperatives. I think it's a very important point that that no single type of source of data can provide comprehensive information on all of those elements that we've just been discussing. Relevant potential sources include, obviously, administrative registrations and specialized censuses or surveys of cooperatives, but also data sources that cover the whole country, the whole economy, not just cooperatives. So there's information available about cooperatives in administrative and statistical registers that cover of businesses that cover the whole economy. Cooperatives are surveyed in censuses and in surveys of enterprises for the whole economy or for specific economic sectors. And people who are members of cooperatives, people who work in cooperatives, are regularly included in labor force surveys, household income and expenditure surveys, housing surveys, and indeed in the population census. But we don't usually identify the fact that they're members of cooperatives or if the enterprises are cooperative in any of those sources. Now, as Marie pointed out, if we use different concepts and definitions, or if different methodologies are used in all of these sources, the statistics that we compile from them won't be comparable. And that really is what the guidelines are about. They try to establish, they do establish standardized definitions of the concepts that need to be measured specifically for the various aspects of statistics of cooperatives. Now, most statistics available about cooperatives are those that come out of the cooperative movement itself. And in many countries, well, some countries, good quality statistics are indeed produced by cooperative confederations or by government agencies with responsibilities for cooperatives, such as ministries. And these data can come from administrative registrations, but also from censuses or surveys of institutions that are registered as cooperatives. And these statistics can provide a very important part of the statistical picture on cooperatives, and they can probably collect some types of information about cooperatives that wouldn't be feasible in surveys of the whole economy. And they can cover things like the number and types of cooperatives, the number of members of cooperatives, about for each cooperative. Therefore, it's actually the numbers of memberships of cooperatives that can collect, the number of employees working in cooperatives, and elements of economic performance, such as value-added, turnover, equity, and assets. However, statistics that are coming out of the cooperative movement are not usually fully comparable with official statistics on the wider economy and on the labor market, or with statistics from other countries. And they're not always produced on a regular basis, such as annually, and they might vary with respect over time and between countries with respect to the scope of the data collected. And they can provide only relatively basic information, such as age and sex, about people who work in cooperatives or are members of cooperatives. You won't find information about the family status or the income of members of cooperatives in a register of cooperative memberships. But when it comes to most official statistics, cooperatives are usually invisible. So the contribution of cooperatives is rarely identified in statistics produced by producers of official national statistics, such as the National Statistical Office or Ministries of Planning, for example. If it were possible to identify cooperatives in the census and surveys used in official economic statistics, this could potentially unlock a wealth of information that's already collected but not visible and that can't be compiled. Similarly, if we can identify work performed in cooperatives or people who work in cooperatives and people who are members of cooperatives in official household surveys, that would allow provision of information about the impact of cooperatives on the lives and work of individuals and of their families. We could understand the types of people who are members of cooperatives, get a better understanding about how they benefit from them or don't benefit from their memberships. So the guidelines provide the definitions that are needed. I'll just go back to the previous slide as well. I think I didn't cover this. If I can manage to go back, yep. Up. So the guidelines aim, first of all, to help cooperative associations and government agencies responsible for cooperatives to improve the comparability of statistics from different sources and to improve consistency and harmonization with mainstream economic and labor statistics. But the guidelines also seek to assist producers of official statistics to improve the identification of information related to cooperatives in relevant data sources and to compile a coherent and comparable range of statistics to measure the contribution of cooperatives to the economy, labor market, and society in principle. What they don't, however, provide is detailed guidance on how to do that. And an important part of this project will be for us to work together to get better experience about how to measure the concepts defined in the guidelines so that we can provide such advice ultimately in hopefully a manual on implementation of the guidelines, and so that we can identify any issues in the guidelines that need to be corrected, or extend the guidelines indeed to include more information about data collection methods. So with that, we can have a quick pause from my voice to see if you have any questions or comments about what's just gone before. Does anyone have their hand up? If you have a question, feel free just to you can press the space bar or unmute yourself and proceed with your question. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a moment so that we can see whether people have questions. I'm going to try to do that.
I think David presentation was so clear. So for this section, I couldn't find any questions.
Okay, thank you. I'm simply following the agenda. The next presentation is a little longer. So I shall move on with that next presentation. Here we go. Start from current slide. So in this second part of this first orientation session, we want to talk about what it is that the guidelines actually contain and what further work is needed. So what do the guidelines actually do? Well, first of all, they include the concepts, classifications, statistical units, and definitions needed to compile statistics on cooperatives. So they basically specify what those are. And they do that in a manner that is consistent with the current international standards for economic and labor statistics. So they specify basic statistical units. By statistical units, we're referring to the things that are being counted or the things that we're collecting statistics about. And they include cooperatives, members of cooperatives, persons, individuals, if you like, as well as jobs or work activities. And they also include the institutional units defined for internationally standardized economic statistics in the 2008 System of National Accounts and the International Standard Industrial Classification, ISIC, Revision 4. So we're talking there about standard units, organizational units defined in those important standards for economic statistics, enterprises, establishments, corporations, financial institutions, non-family, et cetera, et cetera. The guidelines also provide information about the characteristics and breakdowns of cooperatives, of members of cooperatives, and employment in cooperatives that should be included in statistical reports on cooperatives. And they make recommendations about potential data sources and frequency. They note that regular and preferably annual monitoring of cooperatives should take place based on administrative records, if these administrative records are adapted for statistical purposes, as well as from establishment surveys. And they note that data on persons who are members of cooperatives can also be collected through household surveys. But the guidelines don't provide any detailed guidance on data collection methods. So the guidelines provide both reference concepts and operational definitions for cooperatives, types of cooperatives, members of cooperatives, and work generated in cooperatives. Now, this distinction between reference concepts and operational definitions for the non-statisticians amongst us, essentially reference concepts describe what it is that the statistics should aim to measure for the required analytical purposes. So what do we actually want to measure with the statistics? Operational definitions describe what we think you can measure, what we have actually measured, if you like. They describe the information that can feasibly be obtained in data collections to provide sufficiently accurate measurement of these concepts. So we need to understand how accurately the concept that we're measuring reflects the concept that we really want to measure. And for other key concepts that are already defined in international statistical standards, those existing definitions are used. So, for example, a job or work activity is defined as a set of tasks and duties performed or meant to be performed by one person for a single economic unit. So the term job refers to activities in employment. The term work activity refers to activities in other forms of work, such as in volunteer work or in unused production. But what this definition means is that a person who works for more than one employer has more than one job. So there is a separate job for each economic unit that in which a person is employed. And have I skipped a slide? Maybe not. No. So the reference concept of cooperatives defined in the guidelines is derived from the definition of cooperatives that Marie talked about, with the exception that it clarifies that a cooperative is an autonomous association of persons and or legal entities united voluntarily, etc., etc. So it adds that little bit to cover the possibility that the member of a cooperative could be a business. A producer member from a statistician's point of view is actually an enterprise, even though it may be the person who owns and operates the business who has physically registered. So from a statistical point of view, we just want to be completely clear that we're looking at both looking at both natural persons and legal persons. And this definition also covers the main purpose of cooperatives, which is to meet the needs of their members. Now, needs can include things like access to markets, reasonable prices, access to employment, access to tools and machinery, etc., as Marie has already explained to us. Cooperatives are also covered to an extent in the system of national accounts. And within the SNA, cooperatives can either be corporations, either financial or non-financial corporations, or they can be non-profit institutions. Now, cooperatives, according to the SNA, differ from other corporations in that they're democratically controlled by their members according to the principle of one member, one vote. But the SNA doesn't really go any further than that in defining a cooperative. It also notes that cooperatives that are non-profit also differ from other non-profit institutions in that members are the users of goods and services provided by cooperatives. And each member contributes to the capital of the cooperative. And a cooperative is treated as a non-profit institution in the SNA if its articles of association prevent it from distributing any of its profits to its members. So this is actually quite useful in helping us to identify where cooperatives might be found in existing economic statistics based on the SNA. The guidelines also note that mutual societies, self-help groups, or other social ventures as defined in the SNA should not be counted as cooperatives. And this is perhaps one of the issues that we might need to address in taking this project forward, in that in some countries, statistics on these entities might be lumped together with statistics on cooperatives. And the guidelines go into a little bit more depth in terms of the operational definition of cooperatives, by noting that the definition of cooperatives can be operationalized on the basis of 4 criteria. It should be a formally established institutional unit. It should be controlled democratically by its members according to the principle that each member has an equal vote. Membership should be voluntary and non-restricted, and the distribution of profits or surpluses among members should not be linked directly to the capital contributed by each member. Now, these are fundamental defining characteristics of cooperatives, and any enterprise that doesn't meet each of those criteria shouldn't be defined as a cooperative for statistical purposes. And finally, the guidelines note that unregistered cooperatives should be identified separately from cooperatives based on the last 3 criteria. But they should not be counted as cooperatives. And in some countries, this concept of informal cooperatives could be quite important. So basically organizations that operate on cooperative principles, but that aren't formally registered, because lots of businesses in the country may not be formally registered. The guidelines also explain what should be understood by statistics within the scope of cooperatives. So they note that the statistics should not be restricted just to statistics about cooperatives, but also to subsidiaries that are not cooperatives. So if a large cooperative has a number of subsidiary companies that are incorporated enterprises, but they're not themselves organized on cooperative principles, these subsidiaries should also be included within the scope of cooperatives. Similarly, enterprises that are members of cooperatives, so in other words, producer members of cooperatives, the statistics should be compiled separately. They should also be included within the scope of statistics on cooperatives. The guidelines note that to the extent possible, statistics should be compiled separately for each of these types of enterprise. But this broad scope is essential to allow full assessment of the economic and social contribution of cooperatives. So if we want to know about the employment impact of cooperatives, for example, it's not just those who are directly employed in the cooperatives, but also those who are employed in the enterprises that they wholly own, and in enterprises that are members of cooperatives. And the guidelines also point out that inactive cooperatives should be separately identified and excluded from statistics on cooperatives. When we start looking at registers of cooperatives, we quite often find that there are, or even at commercial registers, business registers operated by government agencies, there may be quite a lot of enterprises listed there that are no longer functioning. So the statistics should try to exclude those inactive cooperatives. The guidelines define, as Mary mentioned, 4 main types of cooperatives based on the main interest of the members: producer cooperatives, worker cooperatives, consumer or user cooperatives, and multi-stakeholder cooperatives. This is, of course, a simplification and rationalization of the various classifications of cooperatives or types of cooperatives used at national level. And the purpose of having just these 4 types in the guidelines is to allow the comparison and aggregation of data on cooperatives consistently at both national and international levels. But the guidelines do note that cooperatives should be, the statistics of cooperatives should be systematically tabulated by those 4 main types, as well as by nationally specific subtypes where this is relevant and feasible. And they should also be classified by branch of economic activity and by regions that are relevant in the for national purposes, including urban and rural areas. So when we're talking about the classification of cooperatives, it's not just classification by the type of cooperatives, but classification by various characteristics of cooperatives in line with other types of statistics. Now, in the case of producer cooperatives, the main interest of the members is related to their production activity as enterprises in their own right. So the members, whilst on paper they might be persons, they typically comprise household market enterprises such as small agricultural or craft producers, but they may in some cases also include registered corporations. Subtypes of producer cooperatives can include marketing cooperatives, processing cooperatives, supply or purchasing cooperatives, or cooperatives for management of assets, basically by pooling the resources of a number of small enterprises together for selling produce, for buying produce, for processing their agricultural output, for example. There are economies of scale, and the cooperative is able to negotiate a better price, for example. And they include also multi-purpose cooperatives that might provide both marketing and supply or purchasing facilities to the members of the cooperative. In a worker cooperative, it's the members share an interest in the work provided by or ensured through the cooperatives. So the members are individual workers whose jobs are directly dependent on their cooperative. And this grouping includes worker cooperatives that in some countries are named based on their economic activities, carried out by the cooperative. So for example, there are health cooperatives in Brazil, common exploitation of land cooperatives in Spain, agricultural work cooperatives in Italy, and agricultural cooperative collective farms and cooperative farms in Russia. So it will be quite important in some of these cases where we can have agricultural producers cooperatives, which are cooperatives whose members are producers or small enterprises, farmers in their own right, from an agricultural cooperative, which is a single enterprise and whose members are workers working on the cooperative. So these are important aspects that we're going to need to look at when we're applying the guidelines at national level. The third type is consumer or user cooperatives, and these are quite varied in their types. So members in this case are the consumers or users of the goods or services made available by or through the cooperative. And the subtypes, there are subtypes based on the nature of their activities. So consumer cooperatives in retail, housing tenants cooperatives, and utility cooperatives that provide for water supply, electricity supply, or telecommunication. It's also important to note that financial service cooperatives are classified as part of a consumer, of a type of consumer user cooperatives, even if they also are service producers. So if they produce financial services, that is classified as in the guidelines as a consumer user cooperative. But already we're beginning to see perhaps some of the subtypes of cooperatives that will be relevant at national level. And finally, multi-stakeholder cooperatives. Essentially, it's a cooperative that has more than one type of member or member interest, and more where that more than one type has significant involvement in the activity of the cooperative. That means that more than one type of member should be represented in the governance structure of the cooperative. So a consumer member and a worker member, for example, and no type of member has a dominant position through a majority of votes in the governing body or an exclusive veto over decisions. Otherwise, I guess it's not a cooperative at all. The guidelines also talk about members and memberships of cooperatives. And a member, as we've already stated, a member now either be an individual person or an institutional unit such as an enterprise. And membership should be open to all persons and entities able to use the services of a cooperative and willing to accept the responsibilities of membership without gender, social, racial, political, or religious discrimination. Membership is defined as the number of members of each cooperative. So since both persons and legal entities can be members of more than one cooperative, statistics on memberships are not equivalent of statistics on the number of people or on the number of enterprises that are members of at least one cooperative. And statistics about the number of memberships of an individual cooperative or particular types of cooperative may be very, very useful in assessing their size, significance, and impact, but they don't actually tell us any information about the total number of members of cooperatives. And that's quite an important distinction that we need to make statistically. Without quite going so far as to have a strict classification of types of member, the guidelines do provide a threefold topology that's reflected in the four cooperative types: producer members, worker members, and consumer members. Producer members are essentially enterprises, although in many cases the enterprises would be indistinguishable from the person who owns them. But the enterprises may, of course, have additional workers, employees, contributing family members, etc. Worker members are individual workers, in other words, natural persons who work in the cooperative that they own. And consumer members may be natural persons or institutional units such as corporations or unincorporated enterprises and non-profit institutions. The guidelines also provide quite a lot of advice about statistics on work within the scope of statistics on cooperatives. I note that statistics on work generated by cooperatives, particularly in employment, should be compiled and tabulated separately for work performed by both members and non-members in cooperatives, in economic units that are members of a producer cooperative or multi-stakeholder cooperative, and in subsidiary enterprises owned or controlled by the cooperative. So this sort of mirrors the statistics about cooperatives. Statistics on work within the scope of cooperatives should include all three of these types of work performed in all three of these types of institution. And once again, this is essential to measure the full impact of cooperatives on the labour market and on household income. But it's not particularly easy to measure. measuring work in cooperatives might be one thing. Identifying subsidiary enterprises or enterprises that are members of a producer cooperative in a household survey could be quite difficult. So in the session on Thursday, we're going to discuss a little bit more about how some of these aspects could potentially be measured in statistics from different types of data source. It's important to note that work in cooperatives can be undertaken by both members and non-members, and that it may include all forms of work, not just employment. It can include own-use production work, volunteer work, and unpaid trainee work, and other forms of work. These other forms of work, all of these different forms of work were defined at the 19th ICLS in 2013 in the resolution concerning statistics of work, labour utilization and employment. And the other forms of work refers basically to anything that's not any of those four. It's there as a catch-all, but it includes things like work performed in prisons without pay, work performed as a community service order, for example, mandated by the courts, and that it can also include illegal forms of forced labour. We don't normally measure those forms of work, but the guideline, the international standards recognise that they exist. Now, what the guidelines for statistics on cooperatives do is explain the various circumstances in which members of cooperatives may perform work in their own cooperatives, either as volunteers, as independent workers, or as employees. And they note that worker members are dependent workers. They're either employees of their own cooperative if they're paid a wage or salary for time worked or for each task or piece, or they're dependent contractors if they're paid only in profit or surplus or paid a fee per service. Now, this is in line with the revised version of the International Classification of Status in Employment that was adopted at the ICLS, at the 20th ICLS in 2018. And the reason that we state that worker members are dependent workers, even though they own the cooperative collectively, is that as individual workers, they're dependent on decisions made by at a general meeting of the cooperative by all of the members, or by the management of the cooperative if there's a management committee or someone, the chief executive appointed as manager. The difference in a cooperative is that they have the capacity to influence those decisions that affect their own work. And the guidelines also talk about the treatment of work in the management and administration of a cooperative, or for that matter, any other kind of work performed in a cooperative by members. So if they're performed by owner-operators of enterprises that are members of producers cooperatives, the work performed could be performed for pay by the owner-operator of the enterprise or the producer member, in which case they should be treated as an employee. Or if it's performed without pay, the international standards for status and employment would treat their job as an independent worker in their own enterprise. Essentially, their enterprise is contributing work to the cooperative, which in theory, their own enterprise would benefit from. Work, of course, could be performed by worker members with or without additional pay. And in that case, that would be employment in their job in the cooperative as an employee or dependent contractor. And in the case of consumer members of cooperatives, they may perform work with or without pay in the administration of a cooperative, for example, a housing cooperative. If it's done without pay, it should be treated as volunteer work. If it's done with pay, it should be as an employee. So if someone is paid a wage or salary to look after the books, the accounts of a housing cooperative, then they're an employee of the cooperative that they jointly own. If someone works, is a member of a retail consumer cooperative and has a job in the supermarket working on the checkout, they're then an employee of the cooperative, which they also jointly own. So it's quite simple, but the guidelines sort of make this as clear as possible.
David,
Yes.
can I have can I ask something?
Yes, you can.
What is the precise difference between independence and dependence in worker?
Right, an independent worker,
Yes,
is a worker who owns and controls the work they perform. A dependent worker is dependent on either their employer or on another enterprise for control over aspects of their work,
So
either the amount that they're paid or the way in which the work is performed. So they're both economically and organizationally dependent on another entity.
So it is related to the payment, right?
It's related both to the payment and to the organization of the work. So this concept of dependent versus independent workers and the notion that there are dependent workers who are not employees is something that was introduced at the last International Conference of Labour Statisticians in the resolution concerning statistics of work relationships. And this idea of a dependent contractor was dealt with in part to deal with the gig economy, but also to reflect a long-standing situation in that many small producers, especially in developing countries, are heavily dependent on another agency that controls the price of what they produce, that basically takes all of their products and has control over elements of the work.
Thank you.
So there are quite a lot of small agricultural producers who are not members of cooperatives usually, who are dependent on a large agribusiness or a supermarket chain who has a contract with them to take all of their produce at a fixed price, and then also specifies how they should go, what the material inputs should be, et cetera, et cetera. So those workers would be dependent workers. One of the things that, at least for me, as a specialist in statistics on work relationships, is how cooperatives can impact on that, because the cooperative can increase the agricultural producers' bargaining power through grouping them together. But the agricultural producer may also become dependent on the cooperative.
Yes.
Yeah. So sometimes something, an agency can look like a cooperative, but behave like a large corporation. So this is where we start to get into quite a degree of complexity with the statistics, and we're not necessarily trying to get that far. This is sort of detailed analytical work that researchers might undertake. But basically, in answer to your question, this distinction between dependent workers and independent workers has deliberately been introduced in the official statistics in 2018 to deal with this situation where there are workers who are not employees, who don't benefit from employment contracts, but have commercial contracts with a single, with one main client. who determines who has economic and organizational control over the dependent workers' activities. Can I move on to the next slide? I think I'm getting towards the end of this.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think finally, the economic contribution of cooperatives. First of all, the guidelines note that conventional measures such as value added don't fully assess the positive economic effects of cooperatives, such as countervailing market power, pro-competitive effects, economic stability and resilience, or technical efficiency and innovation. The guidelines note that different measures might be needed depending on the type of cooperative, and that this would require information on a number of different things. Some of those first shown in black on the left-hand side of the screen: employment, revenue, value added, etc. Those things are widely available in official statistics on businesses, and may also be available in cooperative censuses conducted by cooperative federations, etc. But then the guidelines start to mention other things such as the use of profits or surpluses, the earnings of workers within the scope of statistics on cooperatives, the share of transactions with members and non-members. And the guidelines note that to properly measure the economic contribution of cooperatives, it's necessary to collect information on more than just the standard measures, conventional measures used to measure economic performance of businesses and economic sectors. And that the ILO, in collaboration with interested parties, should work on development of measures to assess the economic contribution of cooperatives. Various things have been suggested: value received, value shared, value of volunteer work, patronage refunds, share of intermediate consumption with members. So there's international work that needs to go on in parallel with the work that you're doing to implement the guidelines as they are, in order to develop better measurement of the economic contribution of cooperatives. But that doesn't mean that we still shouldn't try to measure the contribution of cooperatives based on the standard measures as well. So I think that's the end of this presentation, and I hope it hasn't gone on for too long, Daniel. So does anyone have questions or comments, suggestions?
Yeah, thank you, David. This is Ahmed from Tanzania.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
This is Ahmed from Tanzania.
I can hear you, Ahmed.
Yeah, while you are clarifying on Dong's question on dependent and independent workers,
Yes.
I have an experience in Tanzania where you have a factory processing milk, and they are trying to invite individual livestock keepers, and also maybe asking them to form a cooperative so they can supply the factory with milk. So my question is, can a government or even a private sector entity influence people to start a cooperative voluntarily or involuntarily?
I think this is a policy question rather than a statistical question, but yes, I mean, I think a government can influence businesses to establish a cooperative, and it may well be a useful thing to do, provided that it's voluntary. But that's one of the things that we need statistics for, is to provide information that will be relevant to assessing that type of government policy.
Thank you.
People with more of a policy interest might have a better answer to that question.
Okay. Thank you.
I can see Okun. raise his hand.
Hey, like a questionnaire maybe to get data on this work in cooperatives or forms of the work that you mentioned, like these difference between like a dependent worker, like the contractor or etc. So it is sometimes easier to see this kind of questionnaires, actual questionnaires, to understand these classifications. Like I am a bit familiar with this labor statistics. Even the easier concepts we have, like unemployed or employed or one in the labor force, we have many different kind of questions to classify a person who is as employed or unemployed kind of things. And these concepts are new and also more complex than like an unemployed or the one in the workforce. So maybe it's a kind of a pilot survey questionnaires that you can share with us, or we can just have a look at.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, the ILO has developed, the ILO Department of Statistics does provide advice on its website. It provides material resources and a model questionnaire on implementation of the most recent resolutions on labor statistics, including on the identification of dependent contractors. At this stage, however, we're also gathering experience on the best way to collect information about dependent contractors. But for example, questions on who controls the price to be paid for the services provided are quite important. So if we're looking at this distinction between a dependent contractor and an independent worker or an employee, quite a good example that's often used is delivery drivers or taxi drivers. If you look, for example, at Uber drivers, the amount they're paid for their work is controlled by the application, by Uber itself. Access to the work is controlled. Organization of the work is controlled. So the worker is therefore a dependent contractor. Now, taxi drivers have typically and historically organized themselves into cooperatives in many countries that also do exactly the same thing. The difference is that the taxi drivers collectively are able to determine how much they should, what their prices should be, and how work should be distributed amongst the taxi drivers, and who should be allowed, how many people should be allowed to join the cooperative even. Although that might no longer be a cooperative if that's the case, but that's typically the way taxi companies have worked, in that they're collectively, they may be collectively owned by a cooperative, or they by the drivers as a cooperative, or it may be a company that provides a service to register drivers, or get access to a taxi driver's license might have been controlled by the municipality. It's all sorts of different ways in which it works. So I mean, that's sort of one classic example of how new forms of employment are driving this requirement for statistics of this distinction between dependent contractors and fully independent workers. But when we develop that concept of a dependent contractor, it also became very clear that in many less developed countries, and even in some developed countries, it was something that had been going on for a long, long time. Hairdressers who rent a chair in a salon are not employees necessarily of the salon, but they're dependent entirely on the owner of the salon. There are many, many other examples. We were quite surprised to find how much was happening in agriculture, where the price of the product is largely controlled by a single large business.
colleagues, before we move to next, we have another national consultant for Italy. Here we have Chiara. Chiara,
Hi, everyone.
could you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Sorry for being late. I had a plan from Paris and it was late. My name is Chiara Carini and I'm a senior researcher at Eurixe. And I work on statistical projects, both at national and international level. And together with Massimo, I will work on the Italian case study.
Thank you. David?
Hyungsik. Hi, Chiara, it's nice to see you again. Hyungsik has his hand up, don't you? I think. No, it's gone.
Hyungsik?
No, I did not raise my hand. I'm sorry. Yeah.
And I think Edmund Moshi may have raised a hand.
I don't think I raised hand, David. Thank you very much for your comprehensive presentation. I actually could understand new terminologies. I've been working in cooperative for many years, but some of the terminologies that were coming, actually, I couldn't define them if I were to do the surveys. I have one question, though, now that you have raised my name, which is not very clear to me. I liked the example that was given by Ahmed, but I'm giving another one where you find that a cooperative is processing, let's say, milk or coffee, and there are those people or business, let's say informal business men and women who comes and buys the final finished products and sell to the shops. They are not agents to the cooperative, neither are they agents to the shops they sell to or to the market they sell to, but to also they are not paid by anyone. They just add a margin and then sell on their own. But in the statistics I saw about the cooperative some years back, they said at least 1 out of 6 people in the world benefit from cooperative, they either as a member, as an employee, or a businessman. So I was trying to see how do we capture this stakeholder that is not even a member of the cooperative. Over to you, David. Thanks.
So just the first part was a comment about some of the terminology not being able to be used in a survey. I don't think that we would necessarily expect to use all of the terms that I mentioned on a survey form itself, but ask questions in a survey that would allow the relevant information to be compiled by us as statisticians to produce statistics on those concepts. So, but we're not necessarily going to be asking people in the survey, are they a producer member of a cooperative? And try to explain what that means, for example. So we would be asking, well, are you a member of a cooperative? And then asking them about some further information about their relationship to the cooperative. Now, the second situation where someone runs a business which buys the products and sells it on for a small margin. If the cooperative sets the price that they sell to this small business, this buyer, then I guess you could argue that the buyer is perhaps dependent on the cooperative. But I'm not seeing that this is necessarily something that we could easily capture or that is covered by the guidelines as they currently stand. But others may have understood the question differently or have a different opinion. I don't know, and Matthew, for example, whether you have any thoughts about that. Have I answered your question?
Yes, David, thank you. We, of course, continue to engage, and I can see that Lara has shared some of the links already, so we can continue learning from the document. Thanks.
If there are no more questions, I think, Daniel, we have a 10-minute break according to the agenda. Is that okay?
Yes, sure.
I could do with putting some water in this glass.
Yeah. Yeah. So this now is 3:40 since we don't have time. So let us meet again at 3:50.
Perfect.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.